Okay, it's 5 after. And again, we want to thank everyone who is on the Zoom call. Um, I am very excited about our special guest speaker. Is everybody able to hear me okay? Okay, all right, good. So what I'll do is read Dr. Daniel Littlefield's bio. And as I said earlier, after I finish with that, then the floor is his. He will present, and then once he is done with his presentation, we'll open the floor to questions from everyone who's on the Zoom. Daniel Littlefield Jr. holds a Ph.D. degree from Oklahoma State University and was a college classroom teacher from 1960 to 2005. He has been a faculty member at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock since 1970, and from 1983 to 2005, while teaching, he was director of the American Native Press Archives, the world's largest archival repository of Native American newspapers and periodicals. In 2005, he left teaching and became director of the Sequoyah National Research Center, which houses the archives and other major collections. In addition, he has been a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow in the Institute of Southern and Negro History at the Johns Hopkins University since 1973. Has been a visiting professor of history at the University of Arizona, where he was assistant editor of Arizona and the West, 1982, and has taught as a visiting professor of English at the University of Alabama since 1984, and as a distinguished visiting professor of ethno-history at Colgate University since 1997. He is also a scholar, having published scores of articles and the following books in Native studies, of which he is author, co-author, editor, or co-editor: An Encyclopedia of American Indian Removal, 2011, J.W. Parnes, co-editor; Chickasaw Removal, 2010, with Amanda L. Page and Fuller L. Bumpers; Seminole Burning, A Story of Radical Vengeance, 1996; Native American Writing in the Southeast, an anthology, 1875 to 1935, James W. Parnes, co-editor, 1995; Tales of the Bark Lodges by Hinto Wyandotte, James W. Parnes, co-editor, 1995; Kemoha, I hope I said that right, Omaha Stories by Francis L. Flesh, co-editor with James W. Parnes, 1995; The Fuss Fixico Letters by Alex Posey, Carol Hunter, co-editor, 1993; Alex Posey, Creek poet, journalist, and humorist, 1992; The Life of Oka Tubi, 1988; American Indian and Alaska Native Newspapers and Periodicals, 1971 to 1985, James W. Parnes, co-author, 1986; American Indian and Alaska Native Newspapers and Periodicals, 1925 to 1970, James W. Parnes, co-author, 1986; a bibliography of Native American writers, 1772 to 1924, supplement, James W. Parnes, co-author, 1985; American Indian and Alaska Native Newspapers and Periodicals, 1826 to 1924, James W. Parnes, co-author, 1984; a bio-bibliography of Native American writers, 1772 to 1925, James W. Parnes, co-author, 1981; The Chickasaw Freedmen, 1980; Africans and Creeks, 1979; The Cherokee Freedmen, 1978; Africans and Seminoles, 1977, and others, as well as paperback editions of some of the above titles. His most recent research concerns the Dawes Commission to the 5 Civilized Tribes and Indian Removal. He has served as a member of the Cherokee Nation's Great State of Sequoyah Commission and is a member of the Board of Directors of the Arkansas Humanities Council. In 2001, he was inducted into the Oklahoma Historians Hall of Fame. In 2014, the Arkansas Historical Association honored him with its Lifetime Achievement Award for his co-founding of the Sequoyah National Research Center and his promotion of Arkansas history. In 2023, the Arkansas Heritage Celebration of Black History Month named him A Legend Among Us. At the end of the spring 2024 semester, he completed 64 years in his teacher-scholar career. What an amazing career. So without further ado, and thank you so, so much, Dr. Daniel Littlefield.
Well, all that proves is if you can stay perpendicular to the face of the earth long enough, people know your name. I was lucky along the way. I understand that some of you have been reading my Africans and Seminoles, and I thought I might give you a little insight into why I wrote that book. When I was an undergraduate student at Oklahoma State University in 1958, in the summer of '58, I took a course from an eminent historian of the fossилized tribes, Dr. Nancy DuBois. She talked about the African descended people among the 5 tribes, but she admitted that in her treatment of those tribes, she had not done much work in relation to those folks. But she taught about them in the class that I had from her. She said that those lapses in her research were blind spots, is what she called them. And so she urged us, of course, undergraduate students wouldn't take that really to heart, but she urged us to think about, if we intended to be historians, to think about looking into some of those blind spots, she called them. And after having done a lifetime of research, I realized that the historians of her generation can be forgiven a little bit for having lapses in their coverage of certain ideas, because she and her generation were doing research in the national newspapers and documents before the National Archives was ever established in 1934. And they had to go to the old post office building there in Washington, D.C. and dig around in boxes where the national records were kept. And I was an English major and was not intending to go into history at all. But when I turned 21, I was out teaching full time in institutions of higher learning, teaching freshman comp and other writing classes. And one time I looked around after I'd been doing that for several years, and I saw all of these people who were teaching writing, and I was one of them, who basically were teaching writing but not writing themselves. And so I decided I didn't want to be like that anymore. It was going to practice what I preached if I could. And so I started working on Oklahoma history, which was something that I was interested in. And I think that had to do with my growing up, because the town I grew up in was supposedly the first European settlement in what's now the state of Oklahoma. And every year there was an annual celebration of its founding and all that. So I grew up in Cherokee country with a good deal of knowledge about the Cherokee Nation. And so that came as kind of a natural interest for me. And I had told my freshmen, you have a choice of something to write about something you like, something you're interested in. And so I decided to follow my own teaching at that point. But the thing that really inspired me to take the direction I did in that writing was the 1971 publication of Kenneth Wiggins Porter's The Negro on the American Frontier. So inspired by that book, I wrote a grant in 1972, and it was funded, and that gave me the year 1973 at the Johns Hopkins University and the Institute of Southern Negro History. I spent every working day that year in the National Archives. I brought back to Arkansas with me enough research to do a book on each of the 5 tribes, their relationship with slaves and the freedmen in those tribes. And so I started with the Seminoles because that seemed to me the most interesting of the stories that I had researched. Now, if I were to write that book today, I'm like the DeBow. I know there were blind spots, and I would do things differently. I know, for instance, that I would take a harder look at the concept of slavery among the Florida tribes. We know what the travelers and officials, U.S. officials, thought about it. I mean, they knew it was different from chattel slavery in the States, but I don't think that they really knew what they were looking at. Some observers noticed that the so-called slaves were giving tribute to their alleged owners. Well, my question about that is, how is that different from the communal support that was common among any tribal community in the early days? There was no profit motive the way there was in the States. In the agricultural economy, there were no occupations that were labor intensive, physical labor intensive, like in the States. So over time, I became convinced that many of those people who were called slaves were not slaves at all. And many of them that were listed as owners were not owners at all. For instance, if a clerk asked an alleged slave, okay, who do you belong to? Well, the person might respond, he belonged to Michoacan, or he might belong to Michoacan, or some other town leader. And it was simply saying that he belonged to that town, or belonged to that community. And then there were all those runaways from the U.S. Did they automatically become slaves of the Indians? Did they become free blacks? I mean, did they attach themselves to a town or a band? The fact that the slaves didn't run away from the Seminoles and go to the U.S., that tells us something. But what I found in my research with the other tribes, as well as the Seminoles, is that you're going to be hard put to find slave documents in the Indian records. The slave titles are just not there. Now, in the Creek and Cherokee communities, on the eve of removal, some of the people went into the courthouses that had been established in the states of Georgia and Alabama and Tennessee, and recorded in those courthouses the names of people they said were their slaves. And decades ago, a well-informed Muscogee Creek person told me that in many cases, those lists were lists of relatives and family members that the people had gone in and listed to protect them from slave raids or slave claims, either on the road to the west or after removal was over. The federal officials knew that that relationship was different from chattel slavery, and they were determined that they were going to get all the blacks out of the South that had been associated with the tribes. And this was true not just with the Seminoles, but it was true with the other tribes as well. They knew that if those blacks who had been among the Indians for any length of time remained in the South, that they would then name the system of slavery because they would not conform to the strictures of chattel slavery. The blacks in Florida, for instance, they demonstrated that they were perfectly willing to take up arms and fight with the Seminoles against the U.S. Army. And then, Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia was fresh in people's memories. So that was in good reason one of the facts that played on General Thomas Jefferson, Jessup, when he promised the blacks who would surrender if they came in, they would be free people when they got to the West. And the government started this process of paying prominent blacks and prominent Seminoles so much per head if they would bring in people to remove to the West. And some of those people that were being paid to do that came to the West with a lot of money. Now, some of them had trouble collecting. They were supposed to collect in New Orleans, and they had trouble with that. But at any rate, that was part of the government's determination to get those folks out of the South. And they may have solved the problem for the slave owners in the southern states, but they also laid the groundwork for discontent of the Seminoles with the determination of the federal government to make them a part of the Creek Nation, and it laid the groundwork for the migration of Wildcat and other groups to Mexico to seek refuge from not only the politics of Indian Territory, but also the territory of the United States. And that, of course, was also a factor in the Cherokee history as well. There were early on movements toward Mexico by the Cherokee as well. Now, another thing that I would do differently if I wrote Acronyms and Seminoles today is that I would spend more time on the removal itself. You know, it's one thing to say they put them on boats and they went through the Gulf, and then at New Orleans they got on the Mississippi and went up to the Arkansas and up the Arkansas to Fort Gibson. But it's another thing to give people an idea of what actually happened during that trip and what happened to the tribes at some points along the way to humanize the process with more than anything else. Well, when I was working in those early days, I didn't have access to and didn't know about the evidence that could tell us that kind of thing. But we know where that evidence is now, and we have access to it. We know the names of boats and the numbers of people on board those boats that went up carrying Seminoles. We know about the conditions on those boats and events that happened along the way. It's been a slow process, though, getting Seminole story told in that process. When the National Park Service put the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail through the southern states, they registered only on the removal of the Cherokees, because that was the way the legislation read. And of course, the National Park Service had to follow the letter of the law. But what that did was to open new research into the whole process of removal, where we can get down to the nuts and bolts of everyday activity. Now, as it progressed, the National Park Service and the Trail of Tears Association, National Trail of Tears Association, were dead set on just marking on the historical markers the Cherokee story, and they were not interested in talking about any of the other tribes, even though those tribes had gone over some of those roads years before the Cherokees did. We were the last to remove, tried to remove. So we at the Sequoyah National Research Center were under contract for the National Park Service for a number of years doing research on removal, because all of the tribes came through the state of Arkansas somewhere. And we didn't limit our research to just the Cherokees, but we looked at all of the tribes. And as a result of the research we did, we now know where every contingent of every tribe was almost every day they were inside the state of of Arkansas. And that kind of detail you will be hard pressed to find in many stories about the removal that were done in past years. But I think that's about to change. Now, here's how we know all of this. In 2004, an intern and I went to Washington, D.C., under contract with the National Park Service to do research on Cherokee removal, but we didn't limit ourselves to the Cherokees there. The Cherokee archivist who worked at the National Archives, named Jared Clark, told us that we needed the records were that we needed to see, and they were in the archives annex in Maryland. Those were the records of the Treasury Department. And after that, I made 2 additional trips to Washington with members of the Trail of Tears Association from Oklahoma chapter and Arkansas chapter, and worked with them in those records. And so we now have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of records related to the removal of those tribes in the archives here in the center. Now, since we did that research, those archives have been transferred to the main archives downtown Washington, D.C. So if you ever are interested in searching for those or looking in those records, those are now downtown. Now, the reason why those records are so complete was that each removal contingent had a dispersing agent who traveled with the group. And his job was to meet the needs of the people beyond the subsistence goods that were set up at certain stations along the routes, extra food on the boats. They were responsible for buying extra wood if it was needed for firing the boilers on the steamboats, medical supplies, and so on. Now, for every one of those transactions that took place, there was a voucher or a receipt given. Now, we were able, for instance, on the land routes, to take those receipts and see which farmer they bought grain from, or which farmer, if they were buying fodder for oxen or horses, pulling the wagons and so on. And then we would go to the land records and see where they live, state land records, and see where they live. And that told us exactly where these tribes were on particular days at particular places in Arkansas. And we do this all the way across the state. Now, if a boat got stranded on the river, and that was common in the Arkansas River because it fluctuated by season, and if that happened to a group coming up the river, the agent was responsible for getting them off the boat, hiring wagons, oxen teams, horse teams, whatever they were going to pull wagons, whatever they needed for overland travel. And so these people were very versatile and had to go out and talk to people. Many of them would just rent a horse. If they were getting off the boat, rent a horse and go out and talk to farmers and so on. So all those processes ended up in the paperwork, which these disbursing agents had to file with the Treasury Department and balance their accounts. And if they were a dime off, they had to explain it. So in some cases, we get a narrative of not only what happened each day along the way, but excuse me, we get an explanation of why they had to pay this amount for a particular good or that amount for a particular service and so on. So all of this put together keeps giving us a fuller picture of what was actually happening en route during this removal process. Now, those events where people got stranded on the Arkansas River, we had few of those incidents with the Seminoles than we did with other tribes, and that had to do with the seasons of the years they were moving. Some of the years were wetter than others, some drier than others. And so also at Little Rock, there developed during the removal of the earlier tribes, a cold fleet of what was called light draft or lighter steamboats. And these were steamboats that pulled only a foot and a half of water. So they could ply these waters that were very shallow. And so many of them were able to just go on up the river, depending on how they were loaded. Now, during Seminole renewal, we had crafts such as sailing ships and paddle wheeler steamboats in the Gulf of Mexico, flying them from Florida to New Orleans. And on the Arkansas, Mississippi and Arkansas, they used side wheeler steamboats. And they used the side wheelers because most of these steamboats pulled a keel boat or a flatboat, and some of them pull two of those at a time. So when you see these figures that 250 tribal members went up the river on a steamboat, they're not all inside the steamboat, but many of them are riding on these flatboats and keel boats. Now, one of the things that is interesting, I think, about those is that many of them had fireplaces on them. Now, I remember the first time I read Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. You know, Huck and Jim had a fireplace on their raft, and so did these other rafters that they encountered along the river. And as a child, I was a little baffled at how they could build a fire on a raft and not burn themselves up. But these steamboats were equipped with fireplaces on the decks, top decks, which allowed for people to do some cooking. They would let people off the steamboats when they got to wood yards where they were loading wood on to fire the boilers. Some steamboat owners used lime to clean the steamboats out. You can imagine how filthy these became. There was as many people jammed into a small space like that as they did. But there was more to the story than just putting them on the boat and sending them upriver. I mean, that kind of detail makes the story a little more interesting. Now, for those Seminoles, as we said, who went up, were removed, most of them went by water. We had only 3 groups of Seminoles that spent much time on the ground in Arkansas, and I want to talk a little bit about those because we have some stories associated with it. The first group was an 1838 group, which was labeled by the press and by the federal government as Negro Indian or Seminole Negro Party. These were 33 people who had been held up in New Orleans because of slave claims. Now, the government knew that there were slave claims pending in Florida against a lot of people who were living with the Seminoles, but they made it a point to not process those because they knew it was hold up removal. But some of those attorneys who were pushing the claims went to New Orleans and got some of the local courts there to hold up people now and then. The government usually got them released, but it did break up parties there. But anyway, this group of 33 were later released, and they were sent upriver with a dispersing agent named J.B. Benjamin. When they got to Little Rock, they were stopped there because the water was low and there were no light draft steamboats available at the time. And they'd been there some time when a steamboat named the Tecumseh came in with a large number of Cherokees who were being removed under the dispersing agent named Whiteley. These were people who were really reluctant to come get on the boats, and they had deserted all along the Tennessee River until they got to Tuscumbia, Alabama. And so by the time he got to Little Rock, he didn't know how many people he had on the boat. So he put out a gangplank and had the Cherokees walk the gangplank so we could count them. Well, the north side of the river at Little Rock was a gathering place for parties of removal tribes that came in. They had corrals there, and some of the tribes, Chickasaws, Choctaws, across the river there. So it was kind of a nexus of travel routes that came together, water and land routes. And so these 33 blacks were there, and so Whiteley just said to them, get on the boat and go up with us. So they did. Well, they only got about 70 miles by stream to Lewisburg, Arkansas, which fell off into the river. It's no longer there. It's near Morrilton, Arkansas now. And they ran aground. So they had to get off, and the blacks camped with the Cherokees for a number of days, and then Benjamin got them oxen teams, and they started up to north side of the river on land. Military road ran from Little Rock to Fort Gibson on the north side of the river. And so that was the road they took. They were near Clarksville, Arkansas, what's now Clarksville, on Spadler Creek, when a boat carrying Alligator's party of Seminoles stopped at Spadler Bluff, there at the mouth of the creek. The dispersing agent who heard about the 33, they were at that time encamped 18 miles from the river. He rented a horse and went up and got them and brought them back and put them on the boat. And they went on up with Alligator's party of Seminoles. And the Itasca, the ship, the boat they were on, grounded again 2 miles south of Fort Coffee. And they had to get off with the other Seminoles and walk the rest of the way to Fort Gibson. Now, let me tell you a bit about Fort Coffee. Fort Smith had been built to keep peace between the Cherokees who had settled in Arkansas in 1817 and the Osages whose land the government had settled them on. Well, it had been abandoned by the time of removal. And when the Choctaws were beginning to remove in the early 1830s, they built Fort Coffee as a receiving place for the Choctaws that came up the Arkansas River. And then of course Scullyville, which and the Arkansas, the Choctaw Agency was right near Fort Coffee. And it became kind of a stopping point for many of the groups that came up the river. So the second group was a group of Apalachicolas and Dog Island Muskogees from the Panhandle of Florida. They arrived at Little Rock on the Rodney, and because of low water, they had to get on a lighter called North St. Louis, and they got as far as Cadron, near present-day Conway, and they too went grounded and had to get on the road and go on to the Indian Territory by land. And then the third group was an 1842 group was Halleck Testanovich's band of about 100 people. And they got to central Arkansas aboard the Swan. And about 6 miles below Little Rock, they grounded on the sandbar at the mouth of Fish Creek Bayou. They unloaded, and the river was so low that they walked up the riverbed to Little Rock. And at Little Rock, E.R.S. Canby, who was the disbursing agent, had been given enough money to see them on the boat all the way to Fort Gibson. And he didn't have enough money to buy equipment and teams to put them on the road, which was necessary. So he borrowed the money from John Cavallo, John Morse, who was on the boat with them at that point, and he was able to buy teams and subsistence for them for a trip up the military road to Fort Gibson. They went to Potts Station, that near what's now Pottsville, Arkansas, and they turned southwest there, the military road fort, and crossed at Dardanelle. And they are the only Seminole group that crossed the river Dardanelle and went on the military road on the south side of the river to Fort Gibson, probably Fort Smith, and then Choctaw Agency and Fort Coffee. And John Cavallo was on the boat because he was on his way back to the Indian Territory. He had come out with Alligator's party, the one that had picked up the 33 blacks at Spadler. And he had been one of the delegation that went back to the Seminole Nation in 1840 to try to convince other groups to come out. And Halleck Testanovi was one of his successors. So he was on his way back at that point. Now, as I said earlier, we know a lot about many of these river groups, and we know a lot about the ones who were on land. And we can track them, the ones on land, day by day, and we know where the boats were practically every place stopped, because we know where the woodlots were located along rivers and so on. One of the tasks that we have ahead of us is to make sure that we get the public outreach necessary to publicize the story of Seminole removal, Creek removal, Choctaw removal, and Chickasaw removal, because they've been slighted on all of these routes. And some of them, routes that these tribes took, are not even on the National Park Service map. So one of the jobs we have is convincing communities along these routes to get up the, well, I don't know what you call it, stir up the community enough to get them interested in putting up historical markers, because we get people who come into the center and they want to know, okay, where do we go from here? We want to, follow a tribal route, or we want to follow Trail of Tears, or we want, and so we know that there's a public interest in Indian removal. We know that there's a need to give interpretation that's accurate about these removals. And so we're seeing now a little bit of giving on the part of the National Park Service. For instance, the Arkansas chapter of the Trail of Tears Association has a grant before the National Park Service Foundation. And they've been advised all along by National Park Service officials in putting that grant together. And it looks as if it may be funded. And what they're going to do with this is to put up 9 interpretive panels at 9 strategic points along the river that were important in Indian removal. And they're going to do all of the tribes, and this will of course include the Seminoles. And at this point, I can't think of a single sign along the river except at the National Historic Park at Fort Smith that has a panel related to the Seminoles. So this is going to be a real boon, I think, for developing the history. And of course, since most of the Seminoles were moved by river, this is going to include them at every one of these sites along the river. Now, there is going to be one at North Little Rock, and where the ferry site was, because that was a place where the roads from Memphis came in, the roads left out of there on the military road to Fort Gibson area, and the Choctaws and Chickasaws crossed there and went down what was called the Southwest Trail to the Red River country. And so I put together the panel, the mock-up for that one myself, just as a model to try to show others what was possible in this process of building public interest and knowledge about this removal of all of these tribes. And so the National Park Service not only like that, but they've taken that as a model. So if they treated their work, then I think we are in for some better times in terms of getting interpretation of the removal. Now, I can stop. How long will I talk? Have I talked that long?
How long? I don't know. When did you start? It's what,
I don't know.
about 40? Has it been 40 minutes? I
Yes,
had
yeah.
40.
It's been a long time, but
Has it been? It doesn't feel like it.
well, okay, but I want to be sure to get some questions if people have them, or tell me something else they want to talk about.
Yeah, anybody that has questions, please feel free. You can unmute yourself and ask any questions, or if you want to type in and we can read it.
Well, you know me, Wendy, I'm Mr. Technologically Challenged, so I'm going to talk.
Go ahead.
Dr. Littlefield, the records you're speaking of, when you say they're in Washington, D.C., they're in a facility of the National Park Service?
No, they're in the National Archives. And they
the
are
National Archives, thank you.
Yeah, that's a record group. Oh, man, I'll have to think about that. But it was the records of the U.S. Treasury Department, and they are arranged by dispersing agent's name and date. So some of these, like Edward Lee's and some of the others that moved several different tribes and several different years and so on, they will have several files. So if you go knowing the year that you're interested in and who might have been the disbursing agent, then that's how you can tell the reference people and the research assistants how to find the files you're interested in. And these are the physical documents, that the receipts and all that. And I'm telling you, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of those things. So I brought many of them back to Arkansas for this state's. Is the key state in the removal because all the tribes came through, and none of the other states can say that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I was doing some research on an Army officer. Believe it or not, his name was Batman. Batman, yes. I know it sounds strange, but he's the only man in the history of the Army to be named Batman. But he was a young West Point officer, and I can't. I would have to look at my notes. But one of the things that was interesting was he was the escorting officer for one group of people who were being moved from somewhere in the southeast to Oklahoma. And one of these I found was constant messages back to the War Department or whoever was supervising concerning, the ration, when are the rations coming and so on. Where are we supposed to be next quarters and stuff. And I found later that when they arrived in Oklahoma, the group of people he was escorting actually sent a letter of commendation back to the War Department.
Mhm.
And I thought that was quite interesting. Well, I hadn't ever run across one before from any other group that had been gone west.
The interesting thing is that a number of military officers who were dispersing agents or led some students to the West were liked very much by the people that they were moving. Edward Dees, for instance, who moved Muskogee Creeks as well as Cherokees, he seemed to be genuinely sympathetic to the people he was moving, the Cherokees, well, had this idea that these military officers that went along with the groups were somehow guards or in charge of keeping order or something, but they weren't. They were dispersing agents, and so they Bateman, he spelled his name Bateman and Batman both. He was in charge of the group that the Creek leader, Prophet Yeholah, was in, and Little Doctor in that group. And he was the one that ran interference when they were north of Little Rock. They didn't come through Little Rock. They went over what was called the Cadwin to Arkansas Post Road, the old Post Road, we call it now. He tried to get the governor of Arkansas to let them stay in Arkansas until they worked out their political differences with the McIntoshes in Creek Nation, who were in charge of Creek politics at the time. And the governor refused and made him go on. And instead, Prophet Yeholah was considered himself the leading chief of the Creeks before removal. And but he bowed to the McIntoshes, and that eased off the tension between factions in the Creek country. That kind of tension didn't ease off with between the Creeks and the Seminoles, because the federal government had this nasty habit of putting tribes together that really shouldn't be put together. They did that with the Chickasaws and Choctaws as if they were just one tribe. And it took the Chickasaws and Choctaws from 1837 until 1856 to iron out their differences and separate. And with the Seminoles, it took them from removal until 1856 to Chickasaws was 55, Seminoles was 56 before they settled their differences with the Creeks. When I talked about John Cavallo, John Gorse, he was with the group coming back, and he had gone back in 1840. Well, that whole delegation back in 1840 had been told by the government that if they would go back and convince other Seminoles to come out, that the Seminoles would be given a separate nation. Now, they were not a separate nation at removal. They were moved under the title Florida Tribes. And the federal government recognized that they were dealing with different tribes, separate tribes, and they were not a nation at the time. And when they got to Fort Gibson, most of the blacks that were with them camped on Cherokee land around Fort Gibson, and many of the Seminole groups did too. They were supposed to join the Creeks, but only Micanopah and Blackbird's bands went out there into the western part of that Creek Nation. And it took them a long time to iron out the differences. So,
Thank you.
Hey, Carter, did you? Yeah.
Yeah, first off, I just want to say it's so wonderful to understand actually why the Trail of Tears was just Cherokee in everything we ever heard, that it's basically politics and the usual thing, right? The way we throw everything together.
well, you know, I heard someone say not over a month ago that the Cherokees owned that phrase. Well, I've been using it all my life, and I didn't ask them about it. But the fact is that that term was not used until as early as we found 1904. And it was used by an Oklahoma historian who said that the old Cherokees who would point to the roads coming out of Arkansas and say something like those were their trails of tears. Well, they didn't, the historian didn't capitalize it. And then in 1914, a Cherokee woman who was getting her doctorate at the University of Chicago did a dissertation, and she wrote a chapter called The Trail of Tears. And then you had these performers who claimed to be Cherokees, who went around in plains Indian dress and giving talks about the Trail of Tears. But you know, I think the Cherokee historian doctoral student got that term was from the Belgians. The story of the Belgians when Antwerp was invaded by the Germans. The people left their homes, their families were separated, they left their property, they carried what little goods they had, and the press said they left these trails of tears. That was in 1914, the same year this woman wrote that chapter called The Trail of Tears. Now, call me an iconoclast, but you know, people manipulate words to fit, you know, what they have.
So I had another question for you though. What was fascinating was hearing you talk about the awareness you have of how little awareness there was early on, that probably what we called enslavement was not actually enslavement, but maybe even family systems and various other, you know, ways that the Black Seminoles lived with the other Seminoles. I'm always stymied to understand how the transition happened, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about like how, because eventually there were creeks with documents that said we own this person, and it's such a terrible moment in history that could get twisted that way. Do you have opinions or perspectives on that?
Well, we know that the practice among the Creeks is somewhat like, you know, it was with Cherokees and others. Historically, those tribes during wartime would take captives as slaves, they called them, or people called them, who were writing about it. And if those people did well in the community, they were adopted and given clan status and so on. So there was that history among those tribes of taking in outsiders and making them part of the community. But what happened after removal, and I think part of that was the proximity to the slave states. As time passed, the slave codes, if you look at the history of the slave codes among the Creeks and the Cherokees, they look more and more like slave codes in the South. And for instance, in 1842, the Creeks took weapons away from their slaves. So up until that time, they were, and part of it had to do too with the people who were appointed as agents. Like Duval, who was the agent for the Creeks, he was a slave hunter, and they made, Arkansas didn't have a slave trade until within removal, and then the headquarters, the slave trade was in Fort Smith, Arkansas, right on the border. And it was all of those blacks that came with those tribes that these people saw, and all they saw was dollar signs. And so, so their focus was on Indian Territory, wasn't Arkansas. Arkansas didn't have a population speaking at the time. So,
Yeah. It's just such a mystery how they managed to make it stick and, managed to put on paper, I own this person when it wasn't all true.
yeah,
So,
right. Yeah.
thank you.
Okay.
Well, remember the story of the Brackettville Seminoles is that after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, they found people in Oklahoma trying to claim them as slaves, which was one of the reasons they went to Mexico.
Mhm. Well, Mexico had always been a haven, concept of haven for displaced people. For instance, when Arkansas was still part of Missouri Territory, the Cherokee Nation was reserve was set up in west central Arkansas in 1817. Arkansas, but it didn't become a territory until 1819. Well, Bold, who had been chief of Western Cherokees in Missouri and in Arkansas, in the early 1820s, he left the United States and he said, I'm going to a foreign country, and he went to Texas, or what's now Texas, but that was Mexican territory at the time. And that was always, for instance, like in 1842, there was a slave revolt in the Cherokee Nation. They left Weber's Falls and started for Mexico. And some of the blacks who were encamped around Fort Gibson went with them. Cherokees went after them, brought them back, and 3 or 4 of them were executed. But those slaves ran away from what's called old settlers, and those were Cherokees who had lived in Arkansas from 1817 through 1829, and then moved to what was then become Indian Territory. So there was a history of something akin to chattel slavery among some of those tribal members, and I think that always created discontent. And Wildcat left in 1850 because he was politically ambitious and couldn't, fulfill his ambitions in the Indian Territory. So he took a large group out in 1850, and John Cavallo went with him with his. And when they finally did move out to the Creek Nation, John Cavallo and a large number of blacks moved to Wewoka, not with the rest of the tribe, and armed themselves, and they threatened to fight any slave hunters that came out there trying to raid them. And the Creeks, of course, wanted the federal government to send the army in and disarm them, but the government wouldn't do it. And so they went with Wildcat, and then what was it? There was another person that left out of the Seminole Nation or the group after that. So there was always this